Funerals have a way of freezing time. As I sat there staring at my grandfather's closed casket, surrounded by the somber hum of whispered condolences, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. My grandfather was a man of few words, always carrying an air of mystery around his past. He smiled often but shared little, as if carefully guarding chapters of his life that were never meant to see daylight. And now, as his life was being honored with polished eulogies and delicate flowers, I felt a strange tension brewing beneath the surface, like a storm waiting to break. Little did any of us know that storm was about to arrive. Enjoy the story. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked open with a sound that sliced through the stillness like a blade. Heads turned instinctively. A woman stood in the entrance, tall, poised and dressed in a simple navy blue dress that contrasted sharply with the sea of morning black. In her hand, a single envelope. She walked slowly, deliberately, her heels tapping softly against the marble floor as if marking time. No one recognized her, but the way she carried herself, with a strange blend of familiarity and authority, instantly unsettled the room. My mother whispered something under her breath. My father stiffened beside me, and as she reached the front, standing directly beside my grandfather's casket, she turned to face us all. Her voice, calm yet commanding, echoed through the chapel. "I apologize for the interruption, but I bring something your family needs to hear, something your grandfather wanted revealed only after his passing." The room tensed as if the very walls of the church had inhaled sharply and were holding their breath alongside us. The woman's voice was not emotional, nor was it cold. It carried something far more unsettling: certainty. She held the envelope, with the kind of delicate reverence one might reserve for an artifact dug from ancient ruins, fragile but explosive in its implications. The pastor looked to my parents for permission, his hand slightly trembling, as if even he sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. My father nodded stiffly, and my mother gripped his arm, her knuckles whitening. Slowly, almost ceremoniously, the pastor broke the seal of the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The thin paper rustled softly, amplifying the oppressive silence. Every eye was locked on him, every breath suspended, as though the entire church had transformed into a single collective heartbeat awaiting the words that would follow. The pastor cleared his throat, his voice unusually hoarse. "To my family," he began. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and a truth I carried alone must finally come to light." The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls had begun to close in. My pulse hammered against my temples. The pastor continued, his voice wavering between professional duty and personal disbelief. "There is a woman among you today. Her name is Margaret." The mysterious woman lowered her eyes for a brief moment, acknowledging the mention of her No, she is not a stranger. She is in fact my daughter, your sister, and I have kept her existence hidden for reasons that I can only hope you will one day understand." A gasp rippled through the pews like a rogue wave crashing through a still sea. My mother's mouth fell open. My father looked as though he'd been punched in the gut. My own mind struggled to process the words. A daughter? Another child? My grandfather, this man we thought we knew so completely, had been carrying the weight of a secret family for decades. The pastor continued reading, each word slicing deeper into the fabric of our understanding. "Margaret was born from a chapter of my life I locked away, a chapter filled with mistakes, regrets, and circumstances I feared would destroy the family I built afterward. But Margaret is innocent of my choices. She deserved better than my silence." The pastor paused to compose himself, blinking rapidly as if forcing back his own shock. "I've watched from afar as she grew, as she built her life with strength and dignity, and I made arrangements that would, upon my death, finally bring her into the light she always deserved. I could feel the collective unraveling of our family's narrative, as though the very foundation we stood upon had suddenly fractured into countless sharp, unforgiving shards." My mother's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of betrayal. My father looked lost, as though his entire sense of identity had been yanked from beneath him. And yet Margaret stood there steady, composed, her gaze unwavering. She had known this moment would come. She had carried this secret like an iron weight for years. And now, standing before us, she was finally unburdened, though we were only beginning to carry the weight of its consequences. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. The air inside the church seemed heavier, thicker, as though saturated with the enormity of what had just been revealed. My grandfather had lived a double life, a secret daughter, an entire existence none of us had ever suspected. My mind raced, backwards, grasping at memories, searching for missed clues, subtle signs, anything that might have hinted at this hidden chapter. But there was nothing. He had been flawless in his silence. The man I had known as my grandfather, warm, reserved, honorable, had carefully orchestrated a version of his life for us to see, all while shielding us from a truth that would now haunt every one of us. The pastor's voice, once steady, now trembled as he read on. Margaret carries my blood, my legacy, and a portion of my estate, which I have lawfully prepared for her. I leave this decision not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a final act of courage, one I should have made long ago. To my children, I ask only this: do not punish her for my cowardice. Love her as you would have, had I been brave enough to introduce her sooner. His words hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting into the minds of everyone present. My parents sat frozen, struggling to absorb the magnitude of this betrayal. Around us, distant relatives whispered, their faces etched with a mixture of intrigue, outrage, and pity. My own emotions tangled into a confusing knot: anger, curiosity, sadness, all swirling together in an exhausting, disorienting storm. Margaret finally spoke again, her voice carrying the calm strength of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. I understand that this is difficult. I never asked for any of this. I simply honored the promise I made to him, to wait until this day. And now that the truth is out, I have no expectations, only the hope that one day you may find it in your hearts to accept me. Her gaze was steady, yet vulnerable, as if daring us to either reject her or embrace her. Fully aware of how fragile that possibility was, my mother suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she turned sharply and walked briskly toward the back of the church, her heels clicking furiously. With each step, my father remained seated, his eyes vacant, his world evidently still collapsing inward. I watched Margaret closely. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. This was not new pain for her. This was merely the public unveiling of a private grief she had carried for decades. The pastor gently folded the letter, returning it to the envelope as if it were something sacred. The service was no longer a funeral. It had become a revelation, an unraveling of carefully guarded illusions. The family we thought we were had been shattered in a single afternoon, and no amount of flowers or soft organ music could restore what had been lost. The remainder of the service unfolded like a distant echo, blurred by the weight of the revelation. The pastor attempted to steer the ceremony back to its original purpose, honoring my grandfather's life. But the gravity in the room was unrelenting. Every word he spoke was hollow now, overshadowed by the secret that loomed over us like a towering shadow. Guests exchanged discreet glances, their minds clearly no longer fixated on grief, but on scandal, betrayal, and the shock of an unknown sibling suddenly standing before them. My own pulse hadn't slowed. My breath remained shallow, my eyes darting repeatedly between my father's frozen stare and Margaret's calm composure. It was as though I was watching two parallel realities, one just beginning to unravel, and the other having already endured years of silent devastation. When the final hymn faded into a haunting silence, people began rising from their seats in awkward, uncertain motions. Some approached the casket respectfully, others gathered in hushed circles, whispering furiously, as though trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. My father finally stood, his face pale and rigid, and motioned for me to follow him outside. The afternoon sun struck my skin sharply, a sudden contrast to the heavy gloom inside the church. The cemetery lay just beyond a small hill, its headstones glinting faintly under the golden light. We walked toward my grandfather's grave in absolute silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us like a dense fog. I wanted to ask him so many questions. Had he suspected? Had he known and chosen to bury it? But his eyes, lost and distant, told me now wasn't the moment. Margaret emerged from the church a few minutes later, standing alone on the pathway, as if unsure whether she was allowed to approach. The mourners around her avoided eye contact, some glancing at her with thinly veiled judgment, others with silent curiosity. She had suddenly become both part of us and an outsider in the span of mere minutes. My mother remained inside, likely still reeling in a back room, her world crumbling under the weight of years she thought had been secure. And yet, as the sun dipped lower behind the distant trees, casting long, melancholic shadows over the cemetery, I found my own anger beginning to shift. Not toward Margaret, but toward my grandfather, toward the man who had sat at our dinner table, told us bedtime stories, celebrated birthdays, all while hiding an entire daughter from view. As the casket was slowly lowered into the earth, the dull thud of dirt against wood echoed through the valley like soft gunshots. Each handful of soil sounded like another layer of deception being buried alongside him. People began to drift away, one by one, murmuring polite goodbyes as they retreated to their cars. And yet Margaret remained rooted in place, her hands clasped. In front of her, staring into the grave as though offering a silent conversation to the man who had shaped and misshaped her life so profoundly. I stood watching her, my chest tight, feeling a strange, inexplicable pull toward her. A pull that would only grow stronger as the days ahead unfolded and more pieces of my grandfather's hidden world came crashing into the light. The days following the funeral were filled with a suffocating tension that seeped into every corner of our home. Conversations were reduced to fragments, as if any full sentence risked shattering whatever fragile balance remained. My mother barely spoke, choosing instead to immerse herself in household routines with mechanical precision, cooking meals none of us touched, wiping down spotless counters, rearranging objects that didn't need rearranging. My father became a silent specter, moving through rooms like a man lost inside a house that once felt familiar, but now betrayed him with every memory. And I, torn between anger, curiosity, and a deep, gnawing sadness, found myself replaying every interaction I had ever shared with my grandfather, searching for signs I had missed. But the truth was cruelly simple. He had hidden his secret too well. 2 days after the service, an official-looking envelope arrived at our doorstep. My father opened it at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he unfolded the stack of neatly prepared documents inside. The attorney's letter was clear and succinct. My grandfather's estate had been divided into 2 parts. The family we knew, the one gathered at the funeral, would receive what had been long expected. But an equally significant portion had been set aside for Margaret, secured through years of meticulous planning that none of us had ever suspected. My mother read the letter over my father's shoulder, her breath growing heavier with each line, until finally she slammed her hand against the table, sending a sharp crack through the air that made us both flinch. How could he do this to us? She whispered through clenched teeth, her voice shaking with betrayal. All these years, we were nothing but his second family, a cover for his lies. Her words stung, not because they were directed at me, but because they echoed the exact thoughts I had been too afraid to voice. My father closed his eyes tightly, exhaling slowly, as though trying to prevent the dam inside him from bursting open. "We don't know the full story," he said softly, but even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. "We only know what he left behind." Later that evening, as I sat alone in my bedroom, the doorbell rang. I heard my parents exchange brief words in hushed tones, followed by the creak of the front door opening. Curious, I peered around the corner just in time to see Margaret standing there on the porch. She looked different now, no longer the composed figure from the funeral, but vulnerable, her eyes carrying the weight of countless emotions. She clutched a small box against her chest, as if it were fragile glass, My mother stood rigid in the doorway, her expression a carefully controlled mask of politeness, but her knuckles white as she gripped the doorframe. "I don't want to intrude," Margaret began softly, her voice barely audible. "But I have something that belonged to him, and I think you deserve to see it." For a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence between my mother and Margaret was thick, fragile, like a glass wall that could shatter with the slightest wrong move. My father stepped in cautiously, his voice steady but thin. "Come in, please." Margaret hesitated, as though unsure whether she was truly welcome or simply being tolerated. Finally, she crossed the threshold, her eyes scanning the house as if trying to map the world she had always been excluded from. Everything here, every photograph, every piece of furniture, every memory etched into these walls, represented a life she had been denied. Yet she carried herself with remarkable grace, refusing to let bitterness seep into her steps. We sat awkwardly in the living room, an invisible tension pulsing like electricity between us. My mother perched stiffly on the edge of her seat, her arms folded tightly across her chest, while my father sat beside her, leaning forward, as if physically bracing himself for what was to come. I watched from a nearby chair, my heart hammering, unable to decide whether I resented or pitied the woman who sat before us. Margaret placed the small box on the coffee table, her hands lingering on its smooth wooden lid for a moment before she spoke. "He gave this to me years ago," she began, her voice low and steady. "He said that one day, when everything finally came to light, this would help explain some of the choices he made." She opened the box slowly, revealing a stack of letters, photographs, and what appeared to be a worn leather journal. The scent of old paper and faint traces of my grandfather's cologne wafted into the room like ghosts. Margaret carefully lifted the first letter and handed it to my father. His hands shook as he took it, unfolding the brittle paper with trembling fingers. The letter, written in my grandfather's unmistakable cursive, began with a date. Over. 4 decades earlier, the words that followed painted a story none of us were prepared for. "I met Margaret's mother before I met your mother," the letter began. "We were young, foolish, and desperate to escape the weight of our own broken families. But circumstances were cruel. Her family disapproved, and our time together was stolen in fragments, always hidden in shadows. When Margaret was born, I wanted to be there, to claim her, to build a life together. But I was weak. Fear consumed me. Fear of losing everything I would later build with you. Fear of judgment. Fear of scandal." My father's voice cracked as he read, forcing him to pause and gather himself. My mother sat rigid, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes glistening with restrained tears that threatened to break free. The letter continued, describing how my grandfather had secretly provided for Margaret and her mother, watching from a distance but never daring to bring them fully into his public life. "I believed I was protecting everyone," he confessed. "But now, at the end, I see clearly that I was only protecting myself." My father stopped reading for a moment, pressing his fingers to his eyes, overcome with a mixture of anger, sadness, and shame. "There are more letters," Margaret said softly. "He wrote to me often, even when he couldn't be there. I kept everything. Not to hurt you, but because these are pieces of him I never had openly." The photographs revealed a parallel. Life, pictures of my grandfather holding a much younger Margaret as a child, standing beside a woman none of us recognized, smiling in parks, birthday parties, Christmas mornings spent in secret apartments far from our home. The images were raw and undeniable. My mother finally spoke, her voice brittle but piercing. "You had a father who visited you. We never knew. We never saw him leave. How could he keep this from us for so long?" Her words dripped with equal parts bitterness and disbelief. Margaret lowered her eyes. "Not as often as you think, and always in secret. I never got what you had. I only got scraps." The air grew heavier with every word exchanged. My mother's breathing grew more erratic, as though each new revelation was peeling away the carefully constructed layers of the life she believed she had built with my grandfather. The silence that followed Margaret's last words was suffocating. My father leaned back, rubbing his temples as though physically trying to massage away the agonizing reality unraveling before him. I could see the battle playing out behind his eyes, the fierce loyalty to the man he had called Father Waring against the betrayal that now tainted every cherished memory. And for me, as I sat motionless, it was like watching a family portrait slowly burn, one corner at a time, revealing a hidden image beneath that none of us ever consented to see. Margaret continued, her voice steady, but layered with years of unspoken pain. I wasn't allowed to call him Dad, not in public, not even in private sometimes. My mother told me stories, helped me understand why I couldn't have what you had. She said he loved me, but he was trapped in the life he'd built with you. I spent years convincing myself that having some part of him was better than nothing at all. Her eyes glistened now, but no tears fell. She had cried those tears long ago. What remained was a controlled dignity that commanded both respect and heartbreak. My mother looked at her sharply, almost defensively. So you think this? She gestured to the box, the photos, the letters. Makes you one of us? That this somehow erases what he did to our family? Margaret took a breath, pausing as though carefully weighing her next words. No, I don't expect you to see me as family. I understand the pain this causes, but you deserve the truth, and so did I. He was your father. He was my father. Neither of us gets to rewrite that fact, no matter how much it hurts. Her words were like needles, sharp yet undeniable. I glanced at my father, hoping he would say something, offer some form of anchor in this emotional freefall, but his silence screamed louder than any words could have. My mother's face crumbled for a moment as she stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Her back remained turned to us, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though she was physically holding her, whirled together. Margaret shifted slightly, pulling something else from the box, a small, intricately carved wooden music box. She wound its key gently, and a soft, haunting melody filled the room. I recognized it immediately. My grandfather used to hum it during the holidays, absent-mindedly while carving the turkey or decorating the tree. The tune had always felt comforting, to me, a small ritual of our family's traditions. But now, as it played in this new context, it sounded almost sinister, a secret lullaby meant for two separate families who never knew they were sharing the same man. My throat tightened, my stomach turning at the revelation that even the most innocent pieces of our past were stained with this hidden life. When the music finally slowed and stopped, the silence that followed was unbearable. My mother whispered, almost to herself, "He played that for you too, didn't he?" Margaret nodded slowly. Every visit. The pain in my mother's voice was raw, as though she was being robbed of her own memories, piece by piece. And for the first time, I saw Margaret's composure waver. Her chin quivered slightly as she whispered, "I didn't want it to be like this. But I couldn't keep carrying this alone." The house felt colder now, as if the very walls were recoiling from the truth that had been unleashed within them. My father finally found his voice, though it was frail, unsteady, like the first breath after nearly drowning. "I always thought I knew him," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. "I thought I knew every corner of his life. But he carried you, all this time." His voice cracked under the weight of the confession, and for a brief second, I saw him not just as my father, but as a son, grappling with the betrayal of a man he had idolized his entire life. "I'm so angry," he whispered, his eyes filling. "Not at you, Margaret, but at him, because he took away my choice to know you." Margaret's eyes softened, though her body remained still, like a soldier trained to absorb emotional shrapnel without flinching. "I used to imagine how it would feel to finally meet you all," she said softly, her voice layered with exhausted hope. "I pictured warm welcomes, tears of joy, family dinners where I would finally sit at the table instead of watch from afar. But I was foolish. Reality is rarely that generous." Her words cut deeper than any accusation because they weren't meant to provoke. They were simply true. My mother turned from the window, her expression hollowed, drained of fight. "You may be his blood," she said coldly, "but you're not my family." The words hit the room like a slap, harsh, final. My stomach twisted, wanting to defend Margaret, but fearing I had no right. After all, this was my mother's wound. My father closed his eyes tightly, visibly pained by her harshness. But unable to rebuke her, Margaret didn't react. She only nodded, as if she had already rehearsed, hearing these words 100 times before stepping through our door. "I understand," she whispered. "I didn't come here to force myself into your family. I only wanted to give you the truth, because I owed him that much. And perhaps I owed it to myself." The night crept in quietly, casting long shadows. Across the living room, as the conversation thinned into fragile strands of silence, the photos and letters remained spread across the coffee table like scattered remnants of a shipwreck, pieces of two lives that were never meant to collide but had now smashed violently into one another. My mind churned relentlessly, trying to piece together this new identity of my grandfather, a man I had adored, whose stories I cherished, but who now felt like a stranger wearing his face. And yet, beneath my growing anger and confusion, a deeper question gnawed at me. What kind of pain had driven him to live like this, to love two families and imprison them both inside his silence? Margaret stood slowly, sensing it was time to leave. She gathered the remaining letters gently, placing them back into the box with careful reverence. "I'll leave these with you," she said quietly. "You deserve to read them. Maybe they'll help you understand him, even if you never understand me." My father stood too, as if instinctively compelled to escort her to the door. My mother remained frozen, unwilling to acknowledge her any further. As Margaret reached the threshold, she paused and looked back one last time. Our eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, I saw not a threat, not an intruder, but a mirror reflecting a different version of everything I thought I knew about my family. The door closed softly behind her, but its echo lingered far longer than the sound itself. My father stood for a moment, hand still resting on the doorknob, his gaze fixed on the space where Margaret had stood. It was as if he was trying to hold onto the fading imprint of her presence, trying to grasp some fragment of clarity from the whirlwind that had just passed through our home. The house now felt hollow, heavier in its silence than ever before. My mother slowly sat back down, her face unreadable, her eyes vacant as if staring into a void. I sat frozen in my chair, paralyzed by the enormity of emotions warring inside me. Grief for my grandfather, rage for his deception, compassion for Margaret, and a disorienting sense of betrayal that threatened to unravel everything I believed about my family. The hours dragged on as night fell completely, wrapping the house in darkness. None of us spoke. My father eventually retreated to his study, shutting the door behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any argument we could have had. My mother sat in the same chair, unmoving, lost in a silent storm of emotions. She refused to share. I remained in the living room, staring at the box of letters on the coffee table, my curiosity battling my dread. Each letter contained pieces of a version of my grandfather I had never met, fragments of a man who had lived two lives under the same sky, never allowing the two to intersect until death forced his hand. Hours later, unable to resist any longer, I reached for the box. The weight of it felt heavier now, as though the truth itself had mass. I opened it slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile contents, and pulled out the leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, its corners frayed, and the smell of old ink and paper immediately transported me back to childhood visits with my grandfather, where I would sit at his feet as he told stories I now questioned the authenticity of. I opened to the first page, my eyes falling on his familiar handwriting. His words were not just entries, they were confessions. Confessions to himself, to the version of his life he never allowed the world to see. The journal began with vivid descriptions of his early years with Margaret's mother, their secret courtship, the tension with her disapproving family, and the desperate hope they clung to in stolen moments together. He described the joy of Margaret's birth, a moment he called both the happiest and most terrifying of his life. I held her tiny hand and felt like the universe had offered me a second chance, he wrote, but my fear was stronger than my courage. His words were raw, vulnerable, stripped of the careful control he had displayed throughout his life. With every page I turned, I felt as though I was trespassing into a sacred, forbidden space, a space where the man I idolized had bared his soul in ways he never could to those who loved him. The entries grew darker as time passed. Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He described watching Margaret from afar, birthdays missed, milestones observed through distant photographs, brief secret visits that left both of them aching for more. And all the while, he built a separate life with my grandmother, my father, my mother, and me. I've imprisoned myself in two worlds, he wrote. One where I am the perfect husband, father, and grandfather, and one where I am nothing more than a ghost, haunting the child I abandoned. The depth of his self-loathing was both heartbreaking and infuriating. He had loved us all, but in loving both families, he had ultimately betrayed them both. The journal consumed me as the hours bled into the early morning. Each word I read pulled me deeper into the haunting duality of my grandfather's existence. His shame was suffocating, bleeding through every entry like ink stains that refused to fade. He described moments when he would sit at our family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries, all the while feeling the crushing weight of Margaret's absence. Every laugh I share with you all, he wrote, echoes like a betrayal to the daughter I left in the shadows. I see her face in my dreams, growing older without me. I hear her voice in the quiet moments when no one else is around. My love for you all was never a lie, but neither was my love for her. And that, I fear, is my greatest sin. I paused often, needing to catch my breath as the weight of his confessions crushed my chest. The man I had adored, the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, who whispered bedtime stories in my ear, who attended every school recital with a proud smile, he was now unraveling into someone both familiar and foreign. He was not a monster. That would have been easier to accept. He was a man torn by cowardice and guilt, and somehow that made his betrayal feel even more devastating. My mind raced back to Margaret's face, her calm composure, her steady voice, the years of invisible suffering she had endured while we lived in ignorant bliss. The thought of her growing up with only distant glimpses of him while I had full access to his affection gnawed at me with increasing force. I heard soft footsteps approaching. My father entered the living room, his eyes hollow, his face aged, by years in a matter of days. He saw me holding the journal, and for a moment, he simply stood there, unsure whether to speak or retreat. Finally, he sat beside me, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't sleep. I handed him the journal without a word. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it, and he began reading from where I had left off. We sat there together in the dim light, two generations of a family blindsided by the secrets of a man we both thought we fully knew. As he read, tears slipped silently down his cheeks, landing softly on the fragile pages. How could he live like this? My father whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of his grief. How did we never see it? I struggled to find an answer that made any sense, because he didn't want us to see it, I finally said. He built his walls high enough to keep us safe from his guilt, and we never thought to question what was on the other side. My father nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. He should have told us, years ago, when we could have made sense of it together. The pain in his voice was raw, but beneath it was something new, an emerging sense of empathy, even as the betrayal continued to burn. The following hours passed quietly as we took turns reading through the remaining entries. Some pages were filled with anguish, others with tender reflections on moments we had shared, camping trips, graduations, holidays, each now tinged with an underlying sorrow that had always existed beneath the surface. He had lived his entire life balancing on a tightrope, pretending the ground below didn't exist. And now, as we read his confessions, We were the ones left standing in that terrifying void he had so carefully concealed. The sun eventually began its slow rise, casting faint streaks of pale light through the living room windows. My father and I sat in silence, both drained by the weight of what we had consumed through the night. The house around us remained eerily still, as though even the walls were exhausted from holding so many secrets for so long. My mother had not joined us. She remained upstairs, locked away in her own private agony. I wondered what her silence contained, whether it was rage, heartbreak, or simply the numbness of a wound too deep to articulate. There was a quiet understanding between my father and me that morning, an unspoken bond forged by our shared devastation. We had been given the truth, but now we stood beneath its crushing weight, unsure of how to carry it forward. Hours later, as the day unfolded, my father suggested we reach out to Margaret again. The idea hung awkwardly in the air, fragile and precarious. "She didn't have to come forward, you know," he said softly. "She could have kept this all hidden and spared herself the pain. But she chose to honor his request. That has to mean something." I nodded slowly, still wrestling with my own conflicted emotions. "I don't know if Mom's ready," I whispered. My father exhaled, running, his hand through his disheveled hair. "Neither am I, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Later that afternoon, we met with Margaret at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a neutral ground where the weight of home and family history wouldn't press so heavily on us. She arrived alone, dressed modestly, her posture composed but visibly anxious. When she spotted us, she offered a cautious smile, one that spoke not of joy but of careful hope. My father stood and extended his hand, a gesture that seemed to catch Margaret off guard. She shook it gently, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hostility or acceptance. "Thank you for coming," my father said, his voice still tender from the night's emotional battering. We sat down together, and for a moment no one spoke. The hum of casual conversation from surrounding tables filled the silence between us, a strange contrast to the storm swirling within our small corner. Finally, my father broke the quiet. "I've read the journal, all of it," he began, his voice thick but steady. "I can't pretend to understand everything yet. I don't know if I ever fully will. But what I do understand is that you didn't ask for this life. You didn't choose to be hidden. And for that, I'm sorry." Margaret's eyes welled slightly, but she held her composure, nodding gratefully. "I appreciate that more than you know," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt any of you. I wanted to be acknowledged." The conversation began to flow more freely as the minutes turned into hours. We shared stories, small pieces of our respective lives that had never intersected before, but now collided gently in this strange, fragile space. She spoke of her childhood, of birthdays celebrated quietly with her mother, of brief, secret visits where our grandfather would appear like a ghost and then vanish for months. My father and I shared memories of holidays and traditions, of stories that had once felt complete, but now revealed the gaping holes where Margaret had always existed, unseen. And yet, beneath the layers of sadness and betrayal, something unexpected began to emerge, a cautious thread of understanding, stitched together not by forgiveness, but by the simple recognition of shared blood, of shared loss. It was not a reunion, not yet, but it was something. A beginning. As the hours passed, what began as a tense, guarded meeting slowly transformed into something strangely intimate, though fragile, like porcelain balanced on a trembling hand. Each story we shared peeled back another layer of the man we had all loved, revealing not a monster, not a villain, but a profoundly flawed human being who had failed both his families in different ways. For Margaret, hearing about our family traditions was bittersweet. "I used to imagine what it was like," she admitted softly. "Holidays, birthdays, all of you together. I would sometimes walk past houses on Christmas Eve and imagine one of them was yours, with him inside, laughing with you." Her voice broke slightly, but she steadied herself quickly. Trained after years of navigating emotions she was never allowed to express. My father lowered his eyes, overcome by a sorrow that seemed to settle into his very bones. You should have been there. You deserved to be there. The confession wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement, an admission that even though neither of us were responsible for our grandfather's choices, we were now bound by the fallout. Margaret's smile was faint but sincere. "It's strange," she whispered. "For so long I hated you all, not because you did anything wrong, but because you had what I didn't. I envied you. But as I got older, I realized you were as much victims of his decisions as I was." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how much resentment I'd carried toward her since the funeral. Somewhere, deep down, I had seen her as an intruder, someone who had shattered our family. But the truth was undeniable. She had lived her entire life in the shadows of our happiness, receiving only fragments of a father's love while we basked in its full light, unaware that the shadow even existed. My guilt coiled tightly around my chest. "I don't know if I can forgive him," I admitted quietly, almost ashamed to say it aloud. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Margaret nodded. "I don't expect you to. Some things can't be forgiven, but maybe they can be understood. And maybe that's a start." Her calm acceptance was disarming. She wasn't asking for love, or even for family. She was simply offering us the truth, placing it gently in our hands and allowing us to decide what to do with it. My father reached across the table, placing his hand lightly over hers, a gesture so small but monumental in its quiet meaning. Margaret's eyes glistened again, but she didn't look away. She let herself feel it, but she didn't crumble. When we finally stood to leave, the awkwardness returned, though softer this time, tempered by the shared exhaustion of heavy truths laid bare. Outside, the afternoon sun had given way to the cool hush of early evening. The air felt lighter than it had days ago, as though the first breath after drowning was finally being drawn. "Would you like to meet your nephews one day?" my father asked, his voice tentative but genuine. Margaret hesitated only for a moment, her lips parting with a soft, cautious smile. "I would like that," she whispered. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't even healing. But it was a crack of light cutting through years of darkness, a single fragile step towards something none of us yet fully understood. The days that followed were unlike any we had experienced before. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because every object, every photograph, every corner now carried a dual meaning. What once seemed whole now felt incomplete, as though the truth had retroactively altered our very memories. My mother remained distant, still retreating into her private shell, unwilling or perhaps unable to process the weight of this intrusion into the life she thought she had built. Her movements were mechanical, her eyes glassy, betraying a storm beneath the surface that no words could penetrate. My father tried to remain the fragile bridge between two worlds, making quiet efforts to normalize conversations that inevitably collapsed back into silence. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped involuntarily. I knew before even opening it who would be standing there. Margaret. She stood on the porch with a cautious smile, holding a small, thin photo album in her hands. I found something else you might want to see," she said softly. I hesitated, glancing back toward the hallway where my mother was surely listening from behind a closed door. But I nodded and stepped aside, letting her in. The quiet tension settled back into the room like dust floating in a sunbeam. We sat together on the couch, opening the album. Each page revealed photographs I had never seen. Margaret as a little girl holding my grandfather's hand at an amusement park. The two of them sitting by a lake, fishing together on sunny afternoons. Blurry Christmas mornings with modest decorations in an apartment that was clearly not ours. They were images of a secret parallel existence, snapshots of joy marred by the cruel reality of hidden love. "He always promised we'd have a real Christmas one day," she said, running her fingertips lightly over one of the photographs. "A Christmas where he wouldn't have to leave after a few hours." a Christmas where I could finally meet my siblings, but that day never came. Her voice was steady, but the pain beneath it vibrated with every word. I struggled to hold her gaze, the guilt swelling inside me like a tide. For every Christmas I had enjoyed without question, she had waited in silence, holding on to broken promises. I couldn't change the past, couldn't erase her loneliness, but sitting there with her, I felt an obligation rise within me, not out of pity, but out of shared blood, out of the simple human responsibility to not perpetuate my grandfather's cowardice. "I don't know how to make any of this right," I finally admitted, my voice trembling under the weight of its honesty. "I can't pretend I know what you went through. I don't. But if you want to try, if you want to be part of my life, even just a little, I'd like that." The words surprised even me as they left my mouth. I hadn't rehearsed them. They simply came, rising up from somewhere deeper than logic or fear. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, her eyes wide, shimmering. "I would like that too," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly for the first time. In that fragile exchange, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a fragile, honest beginning. A chance to rebuild not what was lost, but what was never allowed to exist in the first place. The days began to change slowly after that fragile moment of honesty. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden healing that swept through our fractured family like a cleansing rain. Instead, there was something far more delicate, a hesitant rhythm of cautious steps forward, each one carrying the weight of decades lost. My father began inviting Margaret to small gatherings, carefully choosing moments when my mother wasn't present, as if shielding her from a wound she hadn't yet allowed to scab over. These quiet meetings were filled with both awkward pauses and unexpected laughter, moments where the sheer absurdity of our situation gave way to brief glimpses of warmth. It was strange, surreal even, to sit across from a woman who shared my grandfather's eyes, whose gestures mirrored the man I had known all my life, yet who had remained invisible until now. One afternoon, my father surprised us both by bringing out an old projector. He used to film everything, my father explained, as we sat around the dimly lit room. The grainy images flickered on the wall. Family vacations, birthdays, summer barbecues, all familiar, all precious. But as the reel continued, something unexpected appeared. A short, shaky clip of my grandfather standing beside a much younger woman, Margaret's mother, holding a small baby I now recognized as Margaret herself. My breath caught in my throat. My father froze, his eyes locked onto the screen while Margaret covered her mouth in quiet shock. He kept this?" she whispered, tears glistening as she watched the fleeting, silent footage of a version of her childhood she never even knew had been documented. It was as if, even in his cowardice, my grandfather had tried to preserve these fragments of his secret life, tiny acts of guilt perhaps, or desperate attempts to hold on to the parts of himself he was too afraid to acknowledge publicly. The film played on, shifting back to familiar scenes of my childhood, my father's birthday party, my own early steps. But the brief glimpse of Margaret's existence among these reels had permanently changed the narrative we had once thought so complete. It was no longer just our story, it was hers too, and it always had been. In the weeks that followed, Margaret met my siblings one by one, each introduction carrying its own weight of caution and vulnerability. Some responded with guarded politeness, others with quiet curiosity, and a few with genuine warmth that surprised even me. Each meeting was like stepping across a narrow bridge suspended between two cliffs, tentative, precarious, but necessary. My mother remained absent from these encounters, her silence speaking volumes. She was not yet ready. Perhaps she never would be. And yet, for the first time, I began to feel the faint pulse of something I had not dared hope for. A slow, reluctant acceptance inching its way into the hollow spaces our grandfather's secrets had left behind. Margaret never pushed, never demanded. She simply showed up when invited, offering her presence as a quiet, patient invitation. And in those moments, I saw her not as the living reminder of my grandfather's betrayal, but as someone who had spent a lifetime carrying pain we had only just begun to taste. Her strength humbled me. She had been forced into the shadows for so long, yet she carried no bitterness in these fragile new beginnings. She simply wanted to belong to a truth that was finally being allowed to breathe. Months passed, and the raw edges of the revelation slowly began to dull, though they never truly disappeared. Our family remained marked by the fracture, but the sharpness of the initial wound had softened into a quiet, persistent ache, the kind that lingers beneath the surface but no longer steals your breath every time you feel it. My mother, though still distant, had begun to lower the thick walls she had built around herself, if only slightly. She would ask occasional questions about Margaret's life, disguised as casual curiosities, never admitting the deeper interest beneath them. My father continued to lead the quiet effort to weave Margaret into parts of our family fabric, never forcing, never rushing, simply offering presence, consistency, and patience, as if making up for the years his father had stolen. One chilly autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled across our backyard, my mother finally agreed to meet Margaret face to face for the first time since the funeral. We gathered on the back porch, bundled in coats, sipping warm tea while the cool wind whispered through the trees. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, fragile as glass. Margaret approached with her usual grace, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though bracing for impact. My mother remained seated, her gaze steady but softer than it had been months earlier. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, the silence between them alive with decades of unspoken words. "I've thought about this moment for a long time," my mother finally said, her voice low, deliberate, "and I still don't know how I feel. Part of me wants to hate you, though. I know that isn't fair. You're not the one who lied to me. You didn't take anything from me. He did." Her voice cracked slightly but steadied again. "But part of me also sees that you lost something, too. And maybe we've both been grieving different versions of the same man all these years." Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. "But I hope, maybe in time, we can at least share what little we have left of him. Even if it's complicated. Even if it hurts." My mother exhaled deeply, her breath rising in a faint cloud against the cold air. Slowly, cautiously, she extended her hand toward Margaret. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a full embrace, but it was enough. A single, trembling handshake that carried with it the weight of everything they both had endured. And in that fragile grasp, something irreversible shifted. From that moment forward, Margaret was no longer just the woman who appeared at the funeral with an envelope that shattered our world. She became part of it, not seamlessly, not easily, but genuinely. Over dinners, quiet conversations, hesitant laughter, and shared memories of a man we all loved in different ways, we slowly began to rebuild something entirely new. Not a restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something honest, fragile, and beautifully imperfect. And as the seasons continued to turn, I often found myself thinking of my grandfather, not as the flawless man I once believed him to be, but as someone deeply human. A man who loved too much and feared too deeply, whose greatest failure was not in loving two families, but in not trusting that love enough to let them exist together. His secret had broken us, but in its unearthing, it had also offered something unexpected, the chance to build a truth none of us had ever dared to imagine. And so, the story that began in grief and betrayal quietly found its way towards something fragile but precious, a beginning that never would have existed without the pain that came before.